So Star Trek Discovery ended its run 3 weeks ago with the 10th episode of its final season, and despite making videos on Discovery all season, I ended up taking a pretty unintended break all of a sudden, so I didn't get to talk about episodes 9 or 10. Now, I'm not really sure what kind of video this is going to be exactly, because it's sort of a review for the final 2 episodes, it's sort of a review for Discovery's final season as a whole, but I think more than anything, I want to just talk about if this was a good ending for the show, because it was an unintended ending, and I think that is kind of clear from the episode. Now, we know that Season 5 was written and filmed almost entirely with the knowledge that they'd be going forward into Season 6, and then just after filming on the Season 5 final wrapped, they found out that it would be their final season. I think this is kind of readily apparent when you watch the final episode, because it's a really long episode. It's 1 hour and 26 minutes long. This might actually be the longest episode in Star Trek history, but I guess only if you consider the older two-parters as separate episodes, and by that I mean, like, the first episodes of some of the older shows, like Encounter at Farpoint, Caretaker, Emissary, they were all aired as like 2-hour movies. Then the final episodes as well, so All Good Things, Endgame, What We Leave Behind. I think Dark Frontier from Voyager was in this kind of bracket as well, but these episodes originally aired as like 2-hour movies with commercials, but officially there are still 2 episodes, so if you look at kind of the list of episodes of the shows or the episode counts, like Caretaker is still officially Voyager's first and second episode, Emissary is still officially Deep Space Nine's first and second episode. If you compare that here, Life Itself, which is the name of Discovery's final episode, is technically just episode 10 of the final season. But if you take that into account, this is probably the longest episode in the franchise's history. I think because of that, this has sort of an okay, this is 2 separate episodes in here sort of deal. Like, the first 50 minutes are completely focused on the Breen stuff, on Raynar's character, on the progenitor mystery, and then it sort of just ends, and we out of nowhere start to cut through these scenes of wrap-ups that do feel quite sudden and out of place. And then the final 20 minutes are just set like 30 years later after the end of Discovery, focusing on an older Michael, an older Buck, and their son, and seeing the final mission of the USS Discovery. And I don't know, maybe it's just me going into it with the knowledge that this episode would have an ending that didn't exactly flow naturally, and an ending that was clearly filmed after the fact, but that's exactly what this felt to me. That the first 50 minutes are clearly just the normal Discovery Season 5 final, and then right when that episode would have ended, with us seeing like Saru get married and such, we cut to scenes that feel a bit more rushed, a bit less real, and more like, okay, we have 3 extra days to film an ending, do what you can. Which, look, I'm not blaming anybody here or saying this was bad. I think they clearly did what they could with what they had, because this is a really unfortunate situation for them to be in. And at least they did get to film an ending, which is something a lot of shows do not get the opportunity to do. But just from like a TV pacing standpoint, I feel like this didn't exactly work or have much of an impact on me. And then, like, if I'm comparing the ending of Discovery here to maybe the ending of like Picard, I think I had very different emotions for both shows. Before going further into this video and kind of doing a proper deep dive into how Discovery ended, I just want to give a quick reminder to subscribe if you're not already. It's a huge help to the channel, and it helps keep the motivation up to make videos like this one. I also am going to try and get back into videos properly now, maybe not as regularly as they were, but often enough. I'd like to try some Star Trek season rankings now that Discovery is over. I think that would be pretty fun. But getting back to the episode, in terms of like my general thoughts on the final 2 episodes, so episodes 9 and 10, since I didn't really talk much about either on the channel, is that I guess they might be my least favourite of the season, unfortunately. And to be fair, I didn't think either were terrible or bad episodes. Like, in Discovery's defense, I think this season I don't think there were any downright bad episodes, but the final 2 episodes felt tonally very different to what the season had done so far, in my opinion. Because I think the general vibe for season 5 was that, like, every other episode would be maybe a Trek style episode where they'd have a planet or dealing with phenomena or something that felt very Star Trek. Then the non-episodic episodes would be focused on the season story, but they'd still also have sort of low stakes. They were very character focused. The mystery was important, but it felt more like we were watching how the characters were dealing with the mystery, and that was what the main episode was focusing on. But then the final 2 episodes of the season to me felt very movie-like in their pacing. It felt like all of a sudden we were just watching a modern day Star Trek movie, but with Discovery's cast. And while I think this might be something maybe a lot of people wanted or were happy with, I didn't love this. And just to clear something up, I see a lot of people say that Star Trek Picard Season 3 is essentially just a really good Star Trek Next Generation movie. I love Star Trek Picard Season 3, so it might feel like I'm being a bit of a hypocrite here, but I think Star Trek Picard Season 3, that yeah, it resembles the Next Generation movies far more than the actual Next Generation show. It would probably be the best Next Generation movie, or very close to the best Next Generation movie if it was one, and I agree with this. I think, yeah, it feels like a movie, but I'm okay with that because Picard Season 3 never changed from its first episode to its last episode. I think the show, to me, kept a very similar vibe and a similar pace throughout its entire 10-episode final season run that maybe got a little more intense in its final, but I still think that overall, Season 3 of Picard felt in line the whole way through for its whole season. For Discovery Season 5, my problem is that these 2 episodes don't feel, at least to me, in line with the rest of the season. To me, it felt like there was a very sudden change to up the stakes and make the season feel more epic and serious, when I didn't think the final 8 episodes felt like that. Like earlier on in the season, we were comparing certain episodes of Discovery to like Shattered in Voyager or Extreme Measures in Deep Space Nine. You know, episodes that, while sure they might forward on some important narrative for the overall season, the core part of the story was episodic and a story for that episode and that episode alone. Like, take Extreme Measures from Deep Space Nine. Yes, it's very important to the final group of Deep Space Nine, or the final arc of Deep Space Nine. Like, going inside Sloane's head was important for the overall story, but that was still one story for that episode. The closest thing I was finding myself comparing the Discovery final to was like Star Trek Into Darkness, and I guess just by extension the entire reboot trilogy. And this was just in terms of the scale and the stakes and this epic battle going on, with like the battle with Discovery really reminded me of kind of like Enterprise versus Vengeance in Into Darkness. And again, I'm not saying this is a bad thing in theory. Like, I actually really like the reboot trilogy, which I know can be seen as a blasphemous thing to say in some Star Trek circles, but I think all 3 of those films are really well constructed, really well made, really fun films. While they might not be the most Star Trek material you can find out there, I think a fact is that those films are very responsible for some people being into Star Trek today that wouldn't have gotten into the franchise otherwise. Which, that's important that Star Trek grows as a fan base. But not to go too off topic here, I think why I don't like Discovery doing this, it's because it doesn't work in the context of what the rest of the season is. Like, we had nothing even remotely similar to this for the rest of the season. And I mean, in the age of TV today, yeah, it's expected that your final episodes have these crazy big set pieces, but I think sometimes you have to evaluate it if it makes sense for the rest of your season. And in Discovery's case this year, I feel like the extent of the action-focused segments in the final didn't. Now, going past that for a second, I do think certain aspects of the episode just didn't hit overly well. There was a major focus on Michael versus Maul that went on far too long, in my opinion. It was a lot of one character points a gun, then they run and jump and do some cool stunts before pointing a gun again. And I don't know, felt a little bland, felt a little lazy and a little boring to me. Meeting the actual progenitor character was cool. I liked that the design was kept quite similar to Next Generation's The Chase, while still getting a slight visual upgrade. Now, this is going to be an absolute bonkers comparison here that I don't think many people will get, but the 100's final episode had a scene that for some reason really reminded me of this, where the main character, Clark, in that show meets with somebody who's a huge spoiler, so I won't say who it is, but just that the background and the setting of that area that Clark was in felt quite familiar and similar to here. But anyway, once we start getting to wrapping things up, the episode starts to lose a bit of its pacing, and it feels like we're kind of rushing through scenes without much time to focus on them. We get kind of an ending for Saru where he goes off and gets married, like had been teased all season. We had an interesting scene with Kovic where we sort of get an answer for who he is. We get this collection of shots where we cut between things from other shows, like we see Geordie's visor, a bottle of Chateau Picard wine, we see Sisko's baseball, which, alright, tiny rant for a sec. Shouldn't that baseball look so much more aged and dirty than it does? Like, there should be some character to that ball there. It looks super clean, it looks super new. Like, even in Deep Space Nine Season 6 and Season 7, where we have characters who aren't Sisko picking up the ball quite often, that baseball looks so much more aged and so much more discolored than it does here. And maybe it's not actually Sisko's baseball, maybe it's just a random baseball, or it's from a different point in history or something, but come on, it's supposed to be a reference to Sisko's baseball, so it should at least look a little bit older than it does. And following up on this, we get the reveal that Kovic is Agent Daniels, or at least somebody who uses the codename Daniels and is maybe a successor or precursor to the Daniels we know from Star Trek Enterprise. This is something I'd love to actually make a video on at some point, because I'm a huge fan of Star Trek Enterprise. I think that show is absolutely criminally underrated and is actually sometimes some of the best Star Trek content you can find. So this was a really cool reveal for me, but a quick summary is essentially that Daniels was a member of the Federation faction of the Temporal Cold War who went back to the 22nd century and ended up teaming up with Archer briefly to stop the Suliban. ended up becoming a recurring character and being somebody who would pop up and help out with things like the Zindi or the Nakul. I'm hesitant to say this is actually the Daniels that we know, which is why I want to make a deep dive video. But Kovac says it's Daniels and he's from the Enterprise among other places, which says to me maybe it's like an agent name that's passed down to protect somebody's real identity, and Kovac is the current keeper of it, and the Enterprise he's from might not be any Enterprise we've seen or heard of. Now, one of the Star Trek Twitter accounts speculated a couple months ago, and then not the like official one, like one of the fan accounts, speculated that Kovac would actually end up being like Future Man from the first 2 seasons of Star Trek Enterprise. Now, Future Man was the character that we never saw the face of and would give orders from the future to the Suliban, with the intention of the writers was for them to eventually reveal that Future Man was a much older Captain Archer, but the show got cancelled before they could do that. I would have been really behind the idea that Kovac was actually a future Archer or something. To be fair though, if we subscribe to the theory that this isn't the Daniels we know, who's to say Kovac isn't actually Future Man or isn't actually Jonathan Archer? That would be really cool. Now, following these scenes, we go through a time jump to the 33rd century where we see much older versions of Michael, Buck, and their son, who is now a captain, going to see the final voyage of the USS Discovery. In some ways, honestly, this did remind me a little bit of the Picard final, where we see Jean-Luc and Beverly take Jack Crusher on a shuttle to join the Enterprise G. I don't know, not in a bad way necessarily, but I guess this did feel familiar and similar enough that I started to wonder, was there some inspiration here where they were like, well, Picard's ending was really good, what if we just do some of that? Since, because they were on a time crunch here, they probably had to write and film this very quickly. Maybe some inspiration there, I don't know. But I guess the scenes were very much represented different things. In Picard, it was very much a new beginning for characters. We were seeing Jack embarking on his legacy and on his journey, whereas here it was more so a definitive ending and goodbye for Michael's character, so similar but different. Now, with all this said, was this a good ending for Star Trek Discovery? Was this an ending that was deserved and earned and worked on an emotional level? Was it just working on a level of being good TV? Or did it fall completely flat? Now, I'm going to ignore the prior 9 episodes, not really being final season episodes, and more so just focus on the 10th episode. And I feel like it's a little strange about Discovery as a whole, because Discovery is a show that you'll probably get varying answers when asking people what they prefer in the show and what seasons are their favorites. And it's an interesting contrast to a show like Star Trek Picard, where with Picard, I think the general consensus is pretty set that season 3 is the best season of the show. Now, of course, some people will prefer season 1 or some people will prefer season 2. That's completely fine, completely valid. But in general, it feels like season 3 of Picard rates a lot higher for most people than seasons 1 and 2. It certainly does for me. I think Picard season 3's quality is insanely different to its quality in seasons 1 and 2. Now, Discovery doesn't exactly subscribe to this, I feel like, because I think over the years, I've seen a lot of people defend or criticize every single season of Discovery. There doesn't ever seem to be one season that the majority say, yeah, this is the best of the show. Some people think the show peaked in its first season, some think it never stopped getting better, some think it peaked with season 3. For me, I'm a little more all over the place. I think every single season of Discovery has something in it that makes it stand out, while every single season of Discovery has something in it that heavily brings it down. For me, early season 2 is where the show peaked. I think the stuff they did with Pike and a lot of the character dynamics in early season 2 are the best the show ever got. But as a whole, I think season 2 might actually be my least favorite season because of how much it sort of defeats itself in the middle and the later parts. Season 1, I think, starts very mediocre, but in the later parts of the season with the Mirror Universe stuff, it actually gets really cool. And then with season 5, I think it's just a very middling season. I don't think anything in it was terrible, but I also don't think anything in it ever overly stood out to me and made me excited or hyped. Like, I was enjoying this season fine, but I felt like every single week my major reaction was that, yeah, that was a fine episode, solid. Maybe it was better than last week's, maybe it was worse than last week's. Dunno, solid episode. That was pretty much my reaction for the entire season outside of like episode 4, which was the time jumping episode, and episode 7, which was the one inside the library. Now, as a final episode, I don't think this was overly fitting as an ending. I'm expecting we'll see a lot of these characters pop up again at some point in Starfleet Academy, since it's the same time period, and there were a lot of references to that in this final episode, which I feel like has to mean something, but a lot of characters were majorly absent in this final episode, and yeah, I understand there were casting, scheduling conflicts, certain people didn't want to be in makeup too much, but I have to judge this for what it is, and without kind of thinking about real world issues that are stopping people from showing up. I think certain characters being so heavily absent at the end of the show was unfortunate and affected the quality of this as an ending. I think the final episode and the final scenes were a goodbye to Michael and Buck and not necessarily a goodbye to the show itself. Like, I didn't necessarily feel like we were really saying goodbye to characters like Saru, or Tilly, or Culber, or Stamets, or any number of other characters. I felt like we were focusing on Michael and Buck, and we were saying goodbye to them rather than the show itself, if that makes any sense at all. And Discovery was never an ensemble show in the same way the other shows were. Like, Discovery was never meant to be a show about Saru or about any of these other characters. It was always the Michael show. She was always the face and the main character, and there's no disillusionment from me there. You look at any of the posters, she's always front and center. I get that this was her show. She was needed to be predominantly the person we were saying goodbye to here. But I just think this episode kind of did a disservice to anyone beyond her and anyone else from the cast, unfortunately. And emotionally, I didn't feel like it overly struck many chords with me. Maybe I was a bit tuned out because after an hour and a half of an episode, it would have to be the greatest thing ever for you, for an episode of TV to be an hour and a half and you'd still be super into it by the end. But I think I just went into this with solid expectations and thoughts on how they'd handle things, and I feel like it never really went above and beyond in the way it maybe should have. So, like, was this a good ending for Star Trek Discovery? If I'm being honest, I would say no. I would say it wasn't a bad ending, wasn't terrible, didn't make me go, that ruins the show, like certain endings do, but it was very much a whatever ending that I feel like I'll probably have forgotten about in a month's time. It's going to be one of those shows that I'll need a reminder on exactly how it ended, because impact-wise, I don't feel like it really left much on me, which is unfortunate because I think Discovery, when it's good, is really good. But this video is crazy late, potentially too late. I feel like anybody who wanted to hear my thoughts on Discovery's final episode probably looked for someone else at this point. But that's my feelings, that's my general vibe on that final. If you watched it, how did you feel about the ending of Discovery? Do you think we have similar thoughts on it, or are we very different on that? Let me know. As always, if you enjoyed this video, maybe consider liking, sharing, subscribing. That would all be a huge help to the channel. And thanks so much for watching, and have an amazing day.